Have you ever wondered why the quietest woman in the room is often the one a man cannot forget? Long after conversations fade and faces blur, she lingers. Not because she tried to impress him, but because her silence revealed a depth his ego wasn't prepared to meet. In a world swollen with noise, her calm becomes a mirror, one that exposes his unresolved longings, his buried fears, and the shadows he has spent years trying to outrun. There is something ancient in the way she withdraws, something that touches the collective memory of the feminine archetype, the maiden who retreats, the mystic who observes, the sovereign who protects her inner world with a discipline men rarely understand. Jung once suggested that a man's unconscious will always reveal itself in the presence of a woman who refuses to be conquered by his persona. And she, the silent woman, becomes the catalyst. Not through words, not through pursuit, but through the sheer gravitational pull of her emotional self-possession. He sees her, at first, the way a man sees anything unfamiliar, with curiosity shaped by ego. He imagines her quietude as shyness, her restraint is timidity, her distance is soft invitation. But he soon discovers that her silence is not a void. It is a landscape. It forces him inward, demanding he confront what he never says aloud. Her stillness stirs the psychic sediment at the bottom of his mind. She becomes the trigger for shadow work that he never consented to begin. And yet, he cannot look away. This is the paradox he wrestles with. The more she withholds, the more he reveals. The more she stands in emotional sovereignty, the more his own inner fractures appear. Men who have not met their shadow often misinterpret this sensation as obsession. They call it attraction because they do not have the language for what is happening beneath the surface, the collapse of their inflated self-image. Her silence becomes the scalpel, her absence the incision. Meanwhile, she walks through the world with a kind of intuitive calm, moving between spaces without announcing her presence, without seeking permission, without performing. She does not rush to fill empty air. She does not fear being misunderstood. You can almost feel the shock ripple through a man who is used to being the center of attention when he encounters a woman who doesn't orbit him. A woman who offers no validation, no approval, no external signs of interest. In her quiet, he is left alone with himself. And for many men, that is the most terrifying encounter of all. There is a subtle cruelty in the way silence exposes truth. Yet her quietness is not meant to wound, it is meant to preserve. She understands that giving her energy to the wrong places is a betrayal of self. She knows that peace is a currency, and she guards it with the discipline of a stoic. Seneca once taught that mastery begins when desire loosens its grip. She learned early that attention is not affection and noise is not connection. So she demands nothing, and in doing so she commands everything. You, listening now, may have felt this dynamic without fully naming it. A moment when a man became unsettled by your restraint. A glance from him that lingered too long. A sudden shift in his behavior, more questions, more attempts to decode you, more urgency than the situation seemed to warrant. That is the beginning of the haunting, not the kind built from manipulation, but the kind born of psychological resonance. The silent woman does not haunt through games. She haunts through contrast. In her presence, he senses what is missing in himself. Her composure reveals his chaos. Her mystery exposes his superficiality. Her softness, unavailable to those who have not earned it, reveals his own emotional immaturity. A man can dismiss a loud woman. He can rationalize away a needy one. But the woman who asks nothing is the one who forces him to question everything. It is in her retreat that he suffers the deepest impact. Not because she slams doors or issues ultimatums, but because she simply steps back into herself. She disappears into her inner world, a place he cannot follow unless he has done the difficult work of confronting his own shadows. Her silence becomes the threshold he cannot cross without transformation. This is why she stays in his mind long after she has walked away. She represents the path not taken, the emotional maturity not yet earned, the depth he desired but could not hold. She awakens the anima, the feminine blueprint living inside him, the part of his psyche that demands growth. And when she withdraws, he is left with the uncomfortable truth that she did not abandon him, she merely stopped carrying the weight of his unhealed self. In the quiet aftermath of her presence, something begins to unravel inside him. It is not dramatic, not loud, not even conscious at first. It starts as a hum beneath the surface, a tension he can't explain, a restlessness he tries to mask with distractions. But the psyche does not negotiate with avoidance. It waits, it watches, it whispers. And when a man encounters a woman whose silence carries weight, his inner world responds in ways he never intended. Her stillness initiates what the Stoics would recognize as a confrontation with the self, an involuntary reckoning. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the soul becomes dyed by the color of its thoughts. In her absence, his thoughts turn dark, not out of malice but out of exposure. Her silence becomes the ink, staining every corner he has refused to explore. This is the part men rarely admit. The attraction he feels is not just toward her, but toward who he becomes in her presence, more aware, more vulnerable, more awake. It unsettles him because he cannot dominate it, cannot rationalize it, cannot reduce it to desire alone. She moves through the world as though guided by an internal compass, one calibrated not to attention but to alignment. Her silence is not empty, it is curated. It contains boundaries, self-respect, and a refusal to perform emotional labor for the unready. And when she withdraws, the lack of her energy exposes his dependence on it. Not dependence on her affection, dependence on the reflection she forced him to see. Without her, the mirror dissolves, and he must face himself without the guide he took for granted. You, perhaps, have felt this power without naming it. That strange shift when a man begins to speak softer around you, as if careful not to disturb the depth he senses beneath your exterior. The way his eyes linger longer than the moment requires, or how his voice lowers when he realizes you're not one to entertain superficiality. Men instinctively recognize a woman who has walked through her own shadows. She carries a different kind of quiet, one not born from fear but from integration. She is not hiding from the world. She has simply outgrown the need to be heard by those who do not listen. Jung understood this phenomenon. He believed that the feminine, when embodied consciously, acts as an initiatory force in a man's psyche, not by teaching, not by preaching, but by being. And the silent woman, the woman who has learned to be comfortable in her own depth, becomes an archetype, the oracle, the inner guide, the anima awakened. She disrupts his habitual patterns simply by existing. Her presence is the invitation, her absence is the lesson. And men who are unaccustomed to emotional introspection experience her silence as both a loss and a lure, a contradiction they cannot resolve. They wonder why she lingers in their thoughts despite giving them so little to hold onto. They replay moments, conversations, pauses. They try to decode her quiet, not realizing that their obsession isn't with her mystery, but with the parts of themselves she illuminated. There is something sacred about a woman who understands the value of restraint. Not the restraint of fear, but the restraint of discernment. She doesn't offer access freely. She doesn't explain her decisions. She doesn't justify her boundaries. And this, more than anything, disturbs the male psyche accustomed to female emotional availability. When she steps back, he feels the vacuum immediately. It's as though the energy that once softened his edges has vanished, leaving him exposed and raw. Her silence becomes a test, a psychological sorting. Those attuned to their own depth will approach with reverence, patience, and curiosity. Those attached to control will react with confusion or frustration. And those who are ruled by ego will retreat entirely, unable to withstand the reflection she brings. Yet she does none of this intentionally. Her silence is not a weapon but a sanctuary. It is where she returns to hear her own voice again, to recalibrate her intuition, to protect the softness she offers only to the worthy. Her quiet is a sacred ritual, a reclaiming of space in a world that constantly asks women to explain themselves. And so, he returns to her memory not because she pleaded for his attention, but because she demanded nothing. Her silence told him the truth. She would not be moved by superficial charm or untempered desire. She would not be swayed by promises unbacked by action. She would not bend simply because he wanted her to. In her quiet, he felt the presence of something rare, self-possession, sovereignty, and depth. He begins to realize that the haunting does not come from her absence but from what her presence awakened. And the more he tries to forget, the more he remembers. Because what haunts a man is never the woman herself, it is the version of him she revealed. In the growing distance between them, an unspoken truth begins to take shape, a truth far older than their brief encounter, rooted in archetypes that move beneath human consciousness like subterranean rivers. The silent woman becomes, without intending it, the figure who stands at the threshold of his awakening. And though he may resist it, though he may deny the impact she has on him, something in him shifts each time her memory resurfaces. It is rarely the intensity of desire that haunts him. It is the revelation that her presence illuminated corners of his mind he never dared explore. A man often believes he is drawn to her for reasons he can articulate: her beauty, her calm, her mystery. But beneath these surface explanations lies a deeper pull, an instinctual recognition of the feminine archetype that Jung described as the anima. She represents the missing dimension of his psyche, the emotional depth he has suppressed, the intuition he has ignored, the vulnerability he has feared. Her silence awakens what he has buried, and when she steps back, the awakening does not cease. It intensifies. There is a unique type of longing reserved for the woman who never asked to be desired, a longing born from the shock of encountering someone who sees through pretense, who listens with her whole being, who responds not to charm but to authenticity. Her silence fractures the illusion he constructed around himself. It forces him to reckon with what he pretends not to feel, and more importantly, it reminds him of the emotional territory he has neglected, perhaps his entire life. You may have seen this unfold, how a man becomes more restless after you stop extending warmth, how he grows more attentive after you withdraw, how he begins asking questions he once never cared to ask. His confusion is not about you, it is about himself. He senses that your silence is not hostility, it is a boundary crafted from self-respect. He senses that your distance is not punishment, it is preservation. And he discovers, often too late, that he took your presence for granted because he assumed emotional strength was easy for you. But the silent woman is not quiet because she is unfeeling. She is quiet because she has learned to choose where her energy goes. She knows the cost of giving too much to those who cannot hold it. She has seen how men cling to her emotional clarity like a rope, expecting her to stabilize them without stabilizing themselves. And so she guards her inner world not out of fear, but out of wisdom. She understands that some men do not seek depth, they seek refuge from their own emptiness. And she refuses to become a shelter for a soul unwilling to grow. Her silence is the language of discernment. It tells him she will not compete for attention, will not chase affection, will not negotiate her worth. Seneca once warned that the greatest loss of life is found in the moments wasted on those who do not deserve them. She lives this truth. She does not waste herself. And it is this refusal to be careless with her energy that turns her into an imprint on the male psyche. Men remember the woman who did not need them. They remember the woman who did not seek validation, who did not collapse under emotional pressure, who did not bend her boundaries for the sake of harmony. They remember the woman who chose herself, even when choosing herself meant walking away. Her silence becomes the echo he cannot outrun, because it represents the standard he failed to meet. And in the quiet of his own mind, he begins to revisit every moment they shared, not because she was flawless, but because she was whole. He realizes that her calm was not passivity but power, that her restraint was not uncertainty but mastery, that her silence was not emptiness but depth. She becomes the archetype of the woman he was not ready for, the woman whose existence exposes the gap between who he is and who he wishes to be. He may attempt to distract himself, convincing his ego that she meant little. But the unconscious has its own memory, and it keeps what the ego tries to discard. She becomes a symbol, the reminder of what authenticity feels like, what emotional presence looks like, what inner strength sounds like when expressed through quiet rather than force. And although she never demanded transformation from him, her absence becomes the force that pushes him toward it. This is the haunting. Not fear, not obsession, but recognition. Recognition of the depth he touched for a moment and then lost. Recognition of the woman who entered his life not to stay, but to awaken. Recognition of the truth that she did not withdraw because she lacked emotion. She withdrew because she possessed too much to waste. There comes a moment, often unspoken and unacknowledged, when the haunting crystallizes into clarity, a moment when he realizes that her silence was never the absence of feeling, but the presence of boundaries he did not recognize. And in that slow dawning, he begins to understand that what unsettled him most was not her distance, but the way her distance stripped him of illusions. She did not play the familiar roles he expected, nor did she respond to his patterns of pursuit or withdrawal. Instead, she existed outside the predictable choreography he had learned to rely on. And this, more than anything, forced him to confront a truth he had avoided. Not every woman is shaped by the fragile scaffolding of male validation. The silent woman offers something more dangerous and more sacred. She offers a mirror. Not a flattering reflection shaped by his desires, but a mirror of accuracy, revealing both his beauty and his brokenness. Jung believed that encounters with the unconscious feel like destiny, yet they arrive as disruptions. She is that disruption. She does not try to fix him. She does not coax him into vulnerability. She simply becomes a presence that awakens the dormant parts of him, the emotional intelligence he denied, the empathy he withheld, the tenderness he buried beneath armor. In her quiet, he confronts the weight of his unexpressed emotions. He begins to see how he avoided real intimacy, not because he lacked desire, but because he feared exposure. The silent woman's restraint brings that fear to the surface. It reveals how deeply he has relied on external noise to shield himself from internal emptiness. Without her warmth, he feels the cold truth of his own emotional neglect. Without her attention, he senses the hollowness beneath his confidence. Without her presence, he recognizes that much of his identity was constructed around being wanted, not known. You may recognize this shift, the moment when a man who once appeared self-assured begins to retreat into himself, no longer energized by the distractions that once soothed him. He becomes quieter, more contemplative, more uncertain, not because she wounded him, but because she awakened him. Her silence becomes the catalyst for introspection he never asked for but cannot ignore. And though he may resist this inner movement, the psyche always moves toward integration, even through discomfort. The silent woman's power is not in withholding affection. Her power lies in her refusal to betray her own self-worth for the sake of connection. She has learned, often through pain, that giving too much to the wrong man becomes a wound that takes years to close. She has learned that not everyone deserves access to her softness, and so she offers nothing she cannot sustain. Her quiet is an act of emotional integrity, a commitment to honoring her own inner landscape rather than bending to the rhythms of someone else's unprocessed chaos. Men do not easily forget a woman who embodies this kind of integrity. They forget the loud, the predictable, the performative, because these interactions demand nothing of them. But the silent woman demands everything without speaking a word. She requires him to show up in truth, to listen beyond language, to meet her in depth rather than possession. And when he fails to rise to that standard, he feels the loss as a fracture in the self, not merely the end of an interaction. She becomes the memory that lingers in the spaces where his distractions fall quiet, in the late-night stillness when bravado fades, in the early morning moments before ego reclaims its throne, in the rare flashes of humility that pierce through his defenses. He remembers her not as an unfinished romance, but as an unfinished transformation. She represents the version of himself he glimpsed but could not yet become. And yet, the silent woman continues moving forward with a grace that eludes him. She does not wait for him to awaken. She does not pause her life in anticipation of his growth. Her path is forged from inner alignment, not external validation. She understands that emotional sovereignty is not a posture but a practice, a daily choice to remain anchored in her truth. She carries herself with a steadiness that comes from knowing she has nothing to prove and nothing to chase. Her silence becomes a sanctuary no one can invade. It becomes the womb of her intuition, the temple of her boundaries, the forge where her self-respect is sharpened. While he wrestles with the echo of her presence, she evolves. While he replays what he failed to appreciate, she expands into versions of herself he never had the privilege to witness. Her growth is not fueled by anger or regret, but by the profound understanding that some connections are meant not to last, but to lift her into higher states of awareness. He eventually understands that she didn't haunt him because she vanished. She haunted him because she remained true to herself. And the shadow she cast across his mind was simply the shape of a woman who did not lose herself trying to be chosen. And as he continues to evolve in his own slow, reluctant way, he begins to understand that what he mistook for her mystery was actually her mastery. Mastery over her emotions, her energy, her intuition. She did not disappear into the shadows of longing or resentment. She stepped into the light of self-possession. This is why she remained unshaken in his memory. She embodied everything he had not yet cultivated within himself. For the first time, he begins to see how profoundly a woman can influence a man not by entering his life loudly, but by leaving it quietly. Her departure was not a storm, it was a shift in atmosphere. It carried no accusations, no ultimatums, no emotional theatrics. Instead, it revealed who he was without her, an uncomfortable but essential revelation. The absence of chaos forced him to confront the chaos within himself. He starts recognizing patterns he once dismissed. The way he kept people at arm's length to avoid truly being seen. The way he mistook desire for depth, attention for affection, chemistry for connection. He realizes that emotional maturity was not something he could project outward. It was something he had to cultivate inward. And her silence, that unshakable stillness, becomes the catalyst for that inner reconstruction. She becomes the archetype his psyche returns to whenever he approaches a new connection, not as a haunting, but as a template, a reminder of the woman who refused to be reduced to an emotional accessory. He remembers how she moved with intention, how she spoke only when her words had weight, how her presence carried both softness and strength without contradiction. The silent woman taught him, through absence, how a woman of depth truly feels. Over time, his longing transforms into clarity. He begins to understand the value of emotional accountability, of transparent communication, of presence without performance. He realizes that love is not something he can stumble into. It is something he must build with the same care she used to build herself. And though he may never cross her path again, she remains the turning point in his story, a quiet revolution disguised as a woman who chose herself. For her, however, the story continues differently. She does not cling to the past or romanticize what might have been. She honors the lessons but refuses to repeat the wounds. She carries herself forward with a refined inner compass, trusting that the connections meant for her will meet her at the depth she naturally inhabits. She knows that the man who is worthy of her silence is the one who can meet her with equal presence, equal depth, equal truth. Her power is not in having been unforgettable. Her power is in never having abandoned herself in the process. And this, ultimately, is the silent woman's legacy, not the echo she leaves in someone else's life, but the resonance she nurtures within her own. What she does not see, but what life quietly reveals over time, is how many men encounter her long after she has walked away. Not physically, but psychically. She becomes an inner symbol, a Jungian imprint formed not through romance, but through the confronting clarity of her self-respect. She becomes the anima figure he misunderstood, the mirror he tried to avoid, the lesson he didn't realize he was living through until it was over. For men who have not reconciled their shadows, she becomes the mythic feminine they project their longing onto. For men who have begun the work, she becomes the reminder of what is possible when a woman does not abandon her soul to earn love. In both cases, she becomes unforgettable, not because she wanted to be, but because she embodied something real in a world where most people perform. She never sought to teach him anything, yet he learned. She never tried to impress him, yet he remembered. She never demanded depth from him, yet he discovered his own lack of it. Her power was never force, it was consequence. But here is the part most people overlook. Her silence is not merely an act of self-protection, it is also an act of creation. In that quiet, she rebuilds herself. She listens to the voice she once muted for the sake of connection. She notices the subtle instincts she used to override. She recognizes the emotional patterns she will no longer repeat. The world may misinterpret her distance as cold, mysterious, or difficult, but she knows it is none of those things. It is discipline. It is discernment. It is self-honoring. And as she grows, slowly, deliberately, she becomes the woman who no longer needs to disappear to protect her peace. She becomes the woman who can stand in her truth without shrinking, without smoothing the edges of her intuition, without diluting her emotional intelligence to make someone else feel bigger. This is the version of her he never met, the version of her he made possible. Life has a way of returning lessons to their source, and one day, months or years later, he may feel a familiar ache when he meets someone new, a subtle recognition, a quiet shift in the air, a reminder, not of her specifically, but of the standard she awakened in him. He may find himself speaking more honestly, listening more deeply, showing up with presence he never offered before, and he will not fully understand why. But she will know, because that is the legacy of a woman who chooses herself. She becomes a turning point in other people's stories while continuing to write her own. When you're ready, I can continue into the next thematic evolution, her rebirth, his integration, or the psychological symbolism behind their dynamic.